Well, hello everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at a time period pretty short really, from the 1880s to the early 20th century. But there's so much that happened in this short period of time that it's best called post-impressionism and beyond. Let's start with a familiar sight. This is Van Gogh as painted by his friend Gauguin. So we're going to be looking at art that begins to move away from realism. And it's important to return to a question that we raised way back in Module 1 as we begin to look at this. And that would be a very simple question. What is a painting? So here we have this portrait of Vincent van Gogh, painted by his friend Paul Gauguin. But it's not Vincent van Gogh. It's an arrangement of pigment on a surface. And that's really all that a painting is. So the artists of the late 19th century began to rebel, well, they continued to rebel against the rules of the academic system, which had told artists what to paint and what was considered appropriate to paint for a couple hundred years. A lot of this was caused by the advent of photography, because artists no longer had to depict reality as they saw it. They could depart from that. So as a result, artists began to experiment in all sorts of ways. They pushed the limits with how they used color, shape, technique, perspective. Pretty much all of the laws around art were called into question at this time, and it can be really interesting to see the results. So what makes a work of art good or bad? Who's to say that a painting has to look exactly like the subject? If the standard for good and bad art is no longer whether or not the painting looks real, then how do you judge a good or a bad work of art? Somebody might say, well, it has to have a strong emotional impact. Okay, but there are artists that we'll be looking at, like the artist Seurat, who had a scientific approach to color and made great art. So the emotional impact reason that makes a work of art powerful, that's only one. So there's so many questions as we look at art, and this topic raises as many questions as it answers. The style of art that came to be known as post-impressionism was created by a relatively small number of artists over just a few years, and it was also a bunch of rebels who were rebelling against the Impressionists. One artist named Paul Gauguin got associated with this group as a collector originally. He was a stockbroker somewhere around Paris, and he loved to paint. So he painted after hours, and eventually he took on the teacher in Camille Pissarro, one of the primary Impressionists. So this tutelage under Pissarro allowed Gauguin to get into 4 of the Impressionist shows. This artist had a utopian ideal, and it seemed to drive him and maybe torture him, as he had spent his boyhood in Peru. And then when he was older, he toured the world as a merchant marine. So when he found himself in a businessman's life, he was very dissatisfied. He had married a Danish woman while he was in his 20s, and they had 5 children. But at the age of 35, after he achieved some success in the Impressionist shows, he just blew it all off and left town. He quit his job as a stockbroker, and he left his wife and children with her family. And this was so that he could pursue this artistic ideal that seemed to chase Gauguin throughout his life. Now, part of this ideal was that he had a romanticized notion of what a tropical paradise might look like. So he went off to Tahiti. He went in search of that paradise. He had a dominant personality, and he had a very strong ego, and he put the pursuit of his art above all other concerns. So all the problems that he felt came his way in life were blamed on this lack of tropical paradise. So he went to the south of France, and he met Van Gogh, and they lived together for a time. But then he left Paris and he went to the island of Tobago, near Panama. Upon arriving on the island, Gauguin's whole vision of a painter's paradise was shattered, Taboga at this time had become sort of civilized. If you see the photographs of the town, it was like a muddy frontier town because the people were laboring to build the Panama Canal. So Gauguin was out of money. He worked 12-hour days swinging a pick until he could get enough money to get to Martinique. And here he found himself very ill, and he had no money. So he did paint several canvases, and he returned to Paris after 7 months. Then he went on to live with Van Gogh. Van Gogh really looked up to Gauguin as a sort of older role model. The two lived together for a time in southern France, but they had a very stormy relationship. They fought, and it was Gauguin's razor that cut off Van Gogh's ear. But eventually Gauguin went back to the islands, and he died young at the age of 54, disillusioned and alone. But he did leave this incredible body of work behind. This one is typical of how he depicted the island women. They always have a sadness in their eyes. That's characteristic of Gauguin's work. So another artist that had a whole different life is Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. He lived in Paris in the last decades of the 19th century, and it was a city of lively decadence. It was a time of overindulgence and a lot of creativity. So there was a whole cast of characters that lived in the artist quarter of Paris, and one of them was this man, Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. He was an eccentric. He had been injured in a riding accident as a child, and so he had stunted legs. His body grew to a man's height, and his legs stayed as they were when he had been injured. His focus was documenting the Paris nightlife in these lithographs, as we see an example here. He was a wonderful painter as well, but this is what he's most remembered for. Here's another of his works. Now, what's good to notice about this particular painting is his composition. Before he finished the painting without this woman in it. So if you can imagine, just cover up your screen and look at what it would be like without the blue-faced woman coming in from the side. She was a famous proprietor of the Moulin Rouge, which was a very famous nightclub where all of the artists would gather. And this man here with the top hat, that's our guy, Toulouse-Lautrec. Toulouse-Lautrec lived out his life at the center of this Paris nightlife, probably indulging more than he should in absinthe and alcohol, and he already had a weak constitution, so he did not live that long. He died of his infirmities at the age of 37. But his work has really embodied this era. Let's move on. Here's one of the most widely recognized post-impressionist artists, and that would be Vincent van Gogh. He's known for being a troubled and complicated person, maybe manic depressive, very probably epileptic, and he had periods of out-of-control behavior. He was the son of a minister from Holland, and the family moved a lot when he was a young boy to small parishes throughout Holland. And yet, even as a boy, he displayed a passionate and sort of an unusual nature. He was always an odd bird. He tried to be a minister, but he was discharged because he was too zealous. He was too enthusiastic in his duties. At the age of 27, he began to pursue his career as an artist, and his brother Theo, who was an art dealer in Paris, was his most loyal supporter throughout his life. Theo was rather sophisticated and did fine in the Paris art world, but Vincent did not thrive at all in this scene because he was known as being coarse and unseemly, and he had extreme mood swings. He also had struggles with alcohol. He was just a troubled man, but he was also a genius. He had himself voluntarily committed several times during his adult life, and the painting to the left is by his friend Toulouse-Lautrec, who we just looked at his work. And this one on the right is painted during one of his times in an asylum. When he was working as a minister, he lived among the poor peasants in coal country. And once he became a painter, he wanted to honor these people. This is one of his first paintings, the first one that really got notoriety. It's called The Potato Eaters, and he explores the life of the peasants as they share their meager meal of potatoes and tea. So he uses these dark, muted colors with the dramatic lights, and it shows their home as being really quite simple. And yet he also shows a certain humanity. Here's a couple of his more widely known paintings. This one to the left is painted when he was living in southern France, and over a period of 4 months, the last 4 months of his life, he painted over 200 paintings. That's amazing when you think about it. Many of them are masterpieces. He believed that color expresses something in and of itself. And when he was on this painting run, painting 200 paintings in 4 months, his canvases really seemed to express this. His most famous work is Starry Night, up to the right above. It's almost too famous, like it's hard to look at it as a work without going, oh yeah, that's Starry Night. Well, he painted this one also from the window of a hospital where he was staying, recovering during one of his rough spells. This last one we're just going to pass through. It's called The Night Cafe, and I just think it's an awesome painting. Look at how he has used the colors, the reds and the greens, just to give a feeling of a kind of a harsh light and a sort of sadness. Also his use of perspective. It's quite powerful. So here's many faces of Van Gogh. Here early to his latest. You can almost see his deterioration as you look at the self-portraits lined up in sequential order. Who else? Oh, what about Paul Cézanne? Many people think of him as the father of modern art, but they always have a father or the grandfather or whatever. Whoever he was very influential. He created art that really did affect the art world for generations to come. It all started with how he expressed how we see the world. And whether you like his work or not, the idea that this humble person who never felt appreciated in his life challenged the way that we see in a way that artists have been working with ever since. That's quite an accomplishment. He believed that all of nature could be broken down in the cone, the cube, the sphere, and the cylinder. That there was enduring shapes and colors that existed throughout nature, and the artist could take that and reproduce it in endless variations. Hey, let's do a comparison. Here's two paintings of the same guy, and that would be Victor Choquet. On the left, this painting is by Cézanne, and the one on the right is by the artist Renoir. Look at the differences. Same person, totally different interpretations. The one on the left, if you were able to see it in person, you would see these kind of loose splotches to suggest skin tone. And the one on the right reflects Renoir's really his dedication to the academic tradition, which is something that he returned to after the Impressionist era. About Impressionism, Renoir said, "I have been as far as I can go there." So let's get back to Cézanne. He believed that all things could be broken down into these simple elements, and art was just a vehicle to express this. So he made these still lifes, and there's a whole bunch of them. They're all a little bit skewed in perspective and simple shapes. It really calls into question what makes a painting good or bad, to return to that question. Now over here is a painting of an area in the French countryside that he painted over and over again. By taking these themes and simplifying them, he really laid the groundwork for modern art and all that was to follow. So now for something completely different, there's the artist Georges Seurat. He believed in something called divisionism, which was a totally scientific approach to painting. Now I like the drawing on the left because it's before he was doing all of this very detailed work. But his most famous painting is Sunday on the on the Grand Island, basically, is how it translates. And this is a large-scale work. I think it's like 10 feet wide. It took him 2 years to complete it. If you were to look at it up closely, you would see little bitty dots of carefully placed color throughout the whole painting, all even, all designed to be optically blended, so blended with the eye. Now, after spending really pretty much the last 2 years of his life on this, George Seurat died very young at the age of 32. Let's look at a couple more of his. What's interesting here in the one on the left is the way the dark value of the background goes against the light value of the background and how they compare to the figure. It really makes it stand out. Hey, let's talk about sculpture for a minute. Auguste Rodin was a sculptor of the late 19th century, and he was trained traditionally, but he broke the norms, and you can see that in his figures here. He was included in shows with Monet, and he was really considered one of the Impressionists. So let's see, what else have we got? Oh, I want to show you one thing here. Notice the expression on this guy's face. That's a detail of this painting, which is the Burghers of Calais. I've actually seen a version of this up close, and it's such a powerful piece, but it was very revolutionary for its time. This is the depiction of a historic event where the main leaders of a town, the town of Calais, had to sacrifice their lives in order to save the town. So in his sculpture honoring these heroes, what Rodin did that was so controversial is he showed them as flawed and struggling human beings rather than as grand heroes on a pedestal. So it took him about 10 years to get this made, and now it's considered a real masterpiece. It's really a very powerful sculpture. Rodin had a contemporary named Camille Claudot, and she was really a magnificent sculptor in her own right. But she had trouble getting recognized as a woman in really what could be seen as a man's world. So here's a photograph of her at work, and I just love that. You know, she must have been an incredible person. She was also a model for many of Rodin's work, and really that was as much as how she gained notoriety, unfortunately, because she was trying to make her way, as I said, a woman in a man's world, really. Hey, what about Matisse? He's one that's also a groundbreaker yet again. You can see with Matisse that we're beginning to move away from any kind of traditional relationship with color. This portrait of him on the right is by his friend André Derain, and together with Matisse, they founded the school of the Fauvists, or the wild beasts of color. And that was a group of artists that were even rebelling against how we express color. Now, if you want to consider all of the influences of the turn of the century, where we have the Industrial Revolution, conflict around the world, everything is in turmoil, that helped to spark these radical artists as they rebelled against the status quo. The figure on the left is really more typical of his early work. One of his most famous paintings is this one called The Green Stripe. Now, you might look at that and go, really? At the time that it was presented, it was seen as a real radical departure from realism. And it's a pretty great example of this Fauvist style of art, as is this one. Here's André Derain's work, and this is really the most famous Fauvist painting. So we don't have any emphasis on shadow here. Really, I guess a little bit under the bridge, but it's mostly about just playing with color. And you could look here also at how they play warm and cool colors off of each other. So the cool colors would be the blues, and the warm colors would be the reds and the oranges. Also the greens are on the cool side of things. And this artist did a great job of alternating those. The term Expressionism is another kind of art. That's why we have to say beyond, because we have Expressionism, we have Post-Impressionism, and we have Symbolism, and there's more. So Expressionism refers to paintings that have a strong emotional content. Most paintings have some emotional draw, but with Expressionism, that is the primary focus of the work. This is probably the most famous Expressionist painting. It's called The Scream, and it's by Edvard Munch. This is on coffee cups, t-shirts. Maybe it's because it's an emotion that so many people can relate to. So when we look at the carefree nightlife in Paris and we compare that to what was going on at this time in this place, Edvard Munch was at a time when tuberculosis was sweeping through his home of Norway. And he had just lost his sister. He was sick himself. His mother was quite ill. And he says he was walking along the fjord at night, and this is the feeling that overcame him. And then he painted, I think, 5 versions of this. And the rest is history, as they say. Hey, let's look at a cyclops. All right, here we have symbolism. Now, by the end of the 19th century, there's another group of artists emerging. They're along the same line as the Pre-Raphaelites, really carrying on that tradition with their use of symbols, their illustration of mythology, and a sort of softness to the work itself. The Cyclops on the right is by the artist Redon, and he was a real pioneer in this school of work. Here's someone whose art is attributed to symbolism also, but a totally different look, and that would be Gustave Moreau. Here you can really see the Pre-Raphaelite influence, but it's also just quite beautiful. The one on the left is called The Whisperer, and the one on the right is Salome. This one on the right is large-scale work, and if you look at the detail, it's just incredibly painted. Here's a completely different kind of art by Henri Rousseau. He's part of the symbolist movement, though. This guy had no art training. In fact, he was a customs officer until he was quite late in life, and then he got into painting. Maybe he painted as a hobbyist while he was still working for the government, but his nickname was the customs officer. In Rousseau's work, we see the land of dreams. He was allowed to show with the Impressionists, but the critics, they did not like his work that much in his lifetime, and now he's become quite collected and quite a favorite. So here we have the monkeys and the oranges, and here we have the animals and the flowers. A lot of his work is along the same lines of having a sort of a fantastical fantasy element. The artist Gustav Klimt was from Vienna, and his work is another one that is often associated with this time period in art, the late 19th century and the turn of the 20th century. His work is both symbolic and in some cases very realistic. This is one of his more sort of symbolic pieces. But this is also a style that he worked in quite a bit. He would use gold leaf, and he would render the faces out in really strong detail and then go out from the figures into a kind of a patterning. I find his work really beautiful. Sometimes in the past, when I would study abstract artists, I would think, oh, they just don't know how to paint realistically. I don't think I still have that belief, but if you're one of the people that does, it can be interesting to notice that the reason that he's going from realism to abstraction is a pure choice. It's not a matter of ability or technique. It's moving away from the boundaries, really, of the need to paint realistically. Okay, let's look at a little bit of architecture as we wind up here. This is from the arts and crafts movement. So, everything is just racing forward in the Industrial Revolution. We have the telephone and the telegraph and on, all of the advances of the late 19th century. Well, there was a group of people that were the antithesis to that movement, especially in design. This is called the Arts and Crafts movement. There were 2 men, John Ruskin, who was a writer in London, and the architect and builder William Morris. The Arts and Crafts movement celebrated the handcrafts and natural elements, moving away from mass production. The artists of the Arts and Crafts movement sought a harmony of form based on natural influences. Here we have the resurgence of stained glass, a lot of large beams. This is a typical arts and crafts kind of a setting. Now, as I said, stained glass, or art glass really, made a big comeback. This one is by one of the most famous stained glass artists, the one many of you have heard of, and that would be Louis Tiffany. Now, Tiffany had a large workshop, so he definitely did not make all of the work that's attributed to him, but he designed it, and he was responsible for it. Another artist that I really enjoy, whose work I really enjoy as a stained glass artist, would be John Lafarge. When you look at his work, you can see a technique of these artists that took the work to a new level. And that would be that they would fire individual panes of glass to have certain designs in them and thus enhance the work. So if you look at the gold halo, that's all very intentional. You can see this on the robes of the figures here and throughout this piece. Now, John Lafarge was a real master at this kind of firing of art glass. I think that's part of why I just really like his work. Another movement, yet another, was Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau is a continuation, really, on the theme. It's kind of a stylization of following of flowing forms. I love this architecture on the right. I mean, it's busy, but it's all in these organic shapes. One of the main artists of the time was named Edvard Mucha, and this is one of his work. What he did was he printed a book, and he printed it as copyright free, so people could use his logos and use his work. All right, we're going to pop over from this kind of stylized architecture to a skyscraper. Well, it's a beginning of a skyscraper. And what I'd like you to remember is that the architect Louis Sullivan is cited as really the father of modern architecture. Oh, we have another father of a movement. But here's what Louis Sullivan did do, is he devised a way to make a cast iron skeleton inside a building and then use masonry or stone on the outside. And this made the early skyscrapers possible. Now, another thing that made them possible, and I think this was in like the very early 1900s, was the invention of air conditioning. Boy, that changed everything. Before we move on, I'd like you to notice the storefront windows of this early department store designed by Louis Sullivan in Chicago. So walking along and looking in the windows was another thing that he invented. So he was really modern in how he put together his buildings, but he believed in this kind of stylization of elements. So when you walk through cities and you look at the art of the late 1800s and the early 1900s, when you look at the architecture of this period, you'll see a lot of this kind of influence. Now, to go in a totally different direction, how about Antonio Gaudi? Now, he was probably more reminiscent of Art Nouveau, but he was a very original artist, and his work is throughout Spain. Here's a house that he built, but here's his cathedral that has been continually under construction for 137 years. Here it is on the right, and here's the interior. He dedicated his life to this, and it was unfinished when he died, and they've been fundraising and finishing it ever since. So, the final slide will return to the artist Matisse, because this slide shows the dedication that some artists have. Even when he was bedridden, he would arrange to have paper put on the walls, or he would draw directly on the walls. He had his charcoal on the stick so that no matter what, he could keep making art. Isn't that interesting? Whatever that is inside some people, and whether you like his art or not, there was something inside of him that motivated him to keep making this artwork up until the final days of his life. Interesting, huh? Well, that brings this slideshow to a close. Thanks for listening.